Thanks very much for the invitation to be here again, and thanks to BBware. So I've been studying bumblebees for over 20 years now, and I'm going to talk to you about various things about them, why they're important, the fact that they're declining, why they might be declining, which will overlap a tiny bit with yesterday's talk. So if you were here for that, forgive me if there's a couple of slides that look the same, but most of it is different. And I'll finish with talking about what you can all do to help. This is just, I realise now, just looking at it, that those numbers refer to the numbers of bees in North America, which is not so useful. So I just want to remind you again that there's more to bees than honeybees. There are 20,000 known species of bee in the world, about 270 in Britain, one honeybee in Britain, 26 bumblebees, and then a whole load of other bees, most of which get no attention at all and which are largely forgotten. If you're really on the ball, you probably know about leafcutter bees and mining bees, but that's pretty much the end of most people's knowledge. And I think the vast majority of the public actually just think there is one species of bee and it lives in a box and it makes honey. But if you ask them to draw a bee, they'll draw something that's big and round with black and yellow stripes, which is definitely not a honeybee. It's actually probably a bumblebee. So there's a lot of confusion out there, and so I think it's really important that we try and educate people, make them aware that there are all these different species of bee, and they're all important. They all do something. They pollinate flowers and so on, and we should look after them. I'm just going to start off with a quick slideshow of some of the weird, wonderful, and lovely bees in the world. Some I took, and some that I've got from friends. But these other bees, the beyond bumblebees, these solitary, most of them solitary species, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some of them are only 2.5 millimeters long, absolutely tiny little things. Some of them look rather wasp-like. Actually, this is a cuckoo bee. There are quite a large number of bee species which have secondarily stopped collecting pollen and making a nest for themselves and simply sneak in and lay eggs in other bee nests, and this is one of those species. There are some stunningly beautiful ones in the tropics. This is a blue-banded armadillo. There are little tiny, it's a common feature of solitary bees is that because they don't, most of them have nests, the males certainly don't. They sleep out at night, and quite often, some British species do this, although this isn't a British species. The safest place they can find to sleep at night is to find the very tip of a twig, and they bite it with their mandibles and then just tuck themselves up so that bee there is just gripping on to the tip of a little twig. It's not touching the twig with its legs at all, and I guess it's the least likely place to be found by an ant or some predator in the night, clinging on like that. This is an orchid bee. Sadly, we don't get them in the UK. This is their South American and Central American things. Amazing, beautiful. If you ever get the chance to go to that part of the world, they're quite big, almost bumblebee sized, and these amazing metallic colours. And they also have this picture on the bottom right here is of the hind leg. The males have enormously enlarged hind legs, and they're hollow with a little hole into them, and they collect the fragrance from a particular species of orchid, and they shove it into their hollow legs, and then they fly around looking for a female, and if they find a female, they waft the perfume from their hollow legs, and hopefully that impresses her. There are also things that pretend to be bees that aren't bees, and this is a really embarrassing cover of a book, Bees of the World. I should say that in defence of Chris O'Toole and Anthony Raw, the authors, that they knew full well that this is actually a fly, but unfortunately the company that prepared the jacket of their book didn't know and put a picture of a fly on the cover of Bees of the World. Must have been very annoying. And actually the silly thing is that this isn't even a very good bee mimic, but there are some flies that are remarkably good bee mimics. Anyway, the ones I work on are bumblebees, the big, furry, kind of cartoon bees, if you like. And they are generally, in the northern hemisphere, the commonest of the wild bees. They all belong to one genus, Bombus, and there are about 250 species of bumblebee known in the world, so we have about 10% of the world fauna living in Britain. They're social bees, apart from a few of them which have become cuckoo bees, which I mentioned earlier. So they have, unlike honeybees, they have an annual life cycle. So if you probably know this, but forgive me for telling you anyway, just in case you didn't. The life cycle of the bumblebee starts, if you like, with queens coming out in early spring from hibernation. They fly around feeding on flowers in late February, early March, as soon as they get a sunny day. And once they've found some flowers and stocked up their energy reserves, they then look for nest sites, and you'll see these great big queen bees flying backwards and forwards, often low to the ground over your lawn or pastures or along hedgerows, and they're looking for holes. If they find them, they go down and explore, and they hope to find an old abandoned mouse or vole nest down there with the insulation that they can then use for themselves, for their own nest. If they find all of that, they build a little ball of pollen, lay some eggs, they sit on it and they incubate it just like a bird to keep it warm. And all being well, after a few weeks, they have their first batch of workers, which are female daughters, which then take over the foraging. So the queens then never leave their nest again. And the nest grows through the spring till about June, July, when it may have 200 or 300 workers. That's all, so much, much smaller than your honeybee colonies. And then it switches to producing new queens and males. And they fly off from the nest. The queens mate almost immediately, and they just mate once, which is also very different to honeybees. And as soon as they've mated, those queens go into hibernation. And in some species, they go into hibernation as early as June, and they sleep right through to the following spring then. So at this time of year, all that's left are young mated queens underground. They burrow into the ground to hibernate. And at the end of the summer, so a few weeks ago, the old nests just fizzle out. The queen dies. The workers eventually die off from kind of old age. The males, they only have that one job in life, just like in honeybees. And they don't do any work in the nest. It's kind of sad, actually. So for reasons no one's ever explained, there are about 7 times as many male bumblebees born as new queens. And given that the queens only mate once, that means that 6 out of 7 male bumblebees never get to do the only thing they were born to do, which is kind of sad, really, isn't it? Anyway, so that's where we are right now. Those young queens hopefully are underground waiting for the spring. They're big and furry for a reason. Bumblebees are unusual insects in that they're really well adapted to living in cold places. Most insects like warm climates. There are many more species of butterfly, dragonfly, grasshopper, and so on living around the equator than there are living in Britain. But for bumblebees, the pattern is the reverse. If you go southwards from Britain, the number of bumblebee species you find actually falls. So by the time you get to the Mediterranean, there's only 1 or 2 species, and you keep going further south and there are no bumblebees. And that's because they don't like hot weather. They're big and furry. They have a fur coat. They're adapted to flying in cold conditions. So this funny diagram shows you where in the world you can find bumblebees. And the redder the colour, the more species of bumblebee live there. And the numbers are how many species are there. And there is somewhere in the eastern Himalayas, the number 60 in a red square. And that is the place, if you were going on holiday to see the most bumblebee species, I don't suppose you would, but just in case you were thinking of a holiday to spot bumblebees, that would be the place to go. Pretty difficult place to get to, but it has 60 species of bumblebees. And we think that's roughly where bumblebees originated, about 30 million years ago. So far as scientists can work out, bees have been around for about 120 million years. So back in the age of dinosaurs, the first bees evolved. Bumblebees came quite a lot later, about 30 million years ago, we think, long after the dinosaurs had been wiped out. And we think they evolved in the mountains of the Himalayas and spread from there west to us and east through Siberia, and some of them nipped over to the Americas and spread down through the Americas. And because there's a big mountain chain that goes right down through Central and South America, they managed to cross the equator and get into South America. But that's the only place where naturally bumblebees occur in the southern hemisphere. So one of the key things about bumblebees is that, so I remember when I was at school, I remember being told by my biology teacher that insects are cold-blooded. So that mammals and birds are warm-blooded, which means we regulate our body temperature at a stable 37 degrees or thereabouts. But things like insects and reptiles and so on, their body temperature is more or less determined by the air temperature around them, and the only way they can warm up is by sitting in the sun. That isn't actually true when it comes to bumblebees and some other large insects like hawk moths. Bumblebees produce heat internally by shivering their flight muscles. So the thorax of the bee is solid muscle inside. It's where the wings and legs are attached. They flap their wings about 200 times a second to stay in the air, and that generates lots of heat, which they keep in with the fur. And that means they can fly around in really cold weather when most insects can't fly. And that's how they live right up in the Arctic Circle, high up in the Himalayas and the Alps. And it also enables one British species, the buff-tail bumblebee, has stopped hibernating. A portion of the population are on the wing for 12 months of the year. So I've actually got these in my garden at the moment on Mahonia, which is one of the many strange exotic things we grow in our garden that flower in the winter. And this species has seemingly adapted to take advantage of garden winter flowers, which naturally didn't used to exist in Britain. And now you can see them all year round. So this is a rubbish picture, but you can probably just about work out there's a bumblebee right in the middle there, feeding on the Mahonia, and that's snow all over the bushes. So you can imagine that was taken in January when the air temperature was hovering around 0, but the bee was flying around quite happily. There hardly any other insects could do that. Your honeybees couldn't do that. Sorry. So this is just an infrared picture of a bumblebee, and you can see that thorax is kind of glowing. You can also probably make out the forceps coming in from the left that are holding that bee there, so you can imagine she's really angry and buzzing away. So all this is very well. It means they can fly around in cold places and early in the year when other insects can't get going. But it comes at a price, which is that it's really energetically costly to fly, to keep warm when you're a small insect. So it's been worked out that a running man burns the calories in a Mars bar in about an hour of running, which is kind of a depressing statistic if you're running to lose weight. But if you were lucky enough to be a man-sized bumblebee, which would be exciting, you could burn the calories in a Mars bar in 30 seconds of flying. So they need loads of energy to keep them in the air, and if they run out of energy, then they're grounded, they can't take off, they can't get to any flowers, they're in trouble. I'm just going to read you a tiny bit from A Sting in the Tail, which is my first memory of bumblebees from when I think I was about 6 or 7. On one occasion, after a heavy summer rainstorm, I found a number of bedraggled bumblebees clinging to my buddleia and decided to dry them out. Unfortunately for the bees, I was perhaps a bit too young to have a good grasp of the practicalities. With hindsight, finding my mum's hairdryer and giving them a gentle blow dry might have been the most sensible option. Instead, I laid the torpid bees on the hot plate of the electric cooker, covered them in a layer of tissue paper and turned the hot plate on to low. Being young, I got bored of waiting for them to warm up and wandered off to feed my gerbils. Sadly, my attention didn't return to the bees until I noticed the smoke. The tissue paper had caught fire and the poor bees had been frazzled. I felt terrible. My first foray into bumblebee conservation was a catastrophic disaster. Actually, with hindsight, the blow dryer probably wasn't the best idea either. The simplest thing to do is just give them some sugar water and let them fire up their own flight muscles and warm themselves up. And you'll often find bumblebees wandering along the pavement, particularly in early spring because there aren't many flowers around. And it's usually simply because they've run out of energy. And if you give them a little bit of sugar, off they'll go. Jumping on about 20 years from my bee burning incident to when I actually got properly interested in studying bumblebees, I was sitting in a meadow near Southampton, watching insects visiting comfrey flowers, and I saw something that I couldn't explain. So, and anyone can see this in their garden, and honeybees do this as well. So if you watch a bee in a patch of flowers, she flies from flower to flower, of course. But she doesn't land on every flower. She often flies up to a flower, like this bee, with her antennae outstretched, but gets very close, but doesn't actually land and put her tongue into the flower. She veers away at the last second and then goes to another flower. And she might do that 2 or 3 times before she actually lands and puts her proboscis into the flower and drinks the nectar. And I was watching this and I thought, I don't know what's wrong with the flowers that she's not landing on. What's she doing? And it took about 5 years and working with one of my PhD students, Jane Stout, to kind of completely unravel what was happening. But to cut a long story short, what bees do is they sniff each flower very, very quickly before they land. And what they're sniffing for is the faintest whiff of the chemical footprint of a previous bee visitor. So every time a bee lands on a flower, she accidentally leaves behind a little greasy smear of oily hydrocarbons from her cuticle. Just as when we put down a wine glass, we leave a little smear of oily fingerprint on it. Bees, when they touch flowers, leave a little tiny smear of chemicals on the flowers. And other bees then use that as a signal that the flower has recently been emptied. If it smells of fresh bee footprint, then it won't have any food in it. The nectar will have been taken, so there's no point in wasting time landing. And it just saves them maybe half a second of flower, which doesn't sound like much, but if a bee is visiting 10,000 flowers a day, then that really adds up, and it means they're more efficient at gathering food than they would otherwise be. In fact, bees have evolved all sorts of really clever ways of gathering food very efficiently, which enables them to produce the honey that we like and so on. And this is all bees, I should say, and not just bumblebees or honeybees. They're very, very clever creatures in lots of ways. In visiting all these flowers to feed their offspring and so on, they pollinate lots of stuff. In the northern hemisphere, literally thousands of species of flowers are dependent on bumblebees to pollinate them. Honeybees, of course, also pollinate many flowers. Those solitary bees pollinate many flowers. And although they overlap in what they pollinate, there are many differences. So, for example, bumblebees come in different lengths of tongue. Different species have different length tongues, and some of the longer-tongued species tend to visit completely different flowers to the shorter-tongued species. So foxgloves are an example of a flower which needs a long-tongued bumblebee to pollinate it, and nothing else will do. So if we want to keep our wildflowers, we need to look after all of our bees, not just one or two. And also, of course, they pollinate lots of our crops. Almost all the tomatoes we've eaten since 1988 were pollinated by bumblebees rather than any other kind of bee. Bumblebees are very good at pollinating garden vegetables. Things like your runner beans are almost all pollinated by bumblebees. Blueberries, raspberries, strawberries and so on, predominantly pollinated by bumblebees. So they're important pollinators and we should look after them. We should be concerned that some of them are disappearing. This just shows you one example of a declining British bumblebee species. This is where it used to be found in the first half of the 20th century, and that's where it's found today. It's disappeared from most of Britain. 3 species have actually gone extinct in Britain. And these things are happening elsewhere in the world. So in North America, in the last 20 years, some of their really common bumblebees have just disappeared from almost the entire continent. So this lovely thing, they call it the rusty-patched bumblebee. It used to be found all across eastern United States. The black and grey area was its range. And not only was it widespread, but it was really common. It was like the buff-tailed bumblebee of North America. It was the commonest thing in people's gardens. And now it's almost gone. The red dots show recent records of it in the last 13 years. And you might think there's a reasonable number of red dots there, but those are just one bee in most cases. It's really, really hard to find any of this species anymore. So they're not doing so well. It would be really nice to have good data on how fast our bees were declining. And this is something I'll come back to a bit later when I'm going to mention citizen science projects that are going on that people might join in to help us gather this data. But it's kind of embarrassing. We have good maps, so we can see when a species goes extinct in a region or a country. But we don't have good population data, particularly for the common bumblebees, so we can't tell whether they're getting less common, which is something we really should know about. And more broadly, we don't have good data for pollinators, which is really worrying. For bumblebees, in an ideal world, we would count the nests every year per square mile or in whatever area we were interested in, because each nest is one breeding female. That would be the best measure of how big the population is. But it's really hard to do because bumblebee nests are hidden down little holes in the ground, as I mentioned earlier, and they're very hard to find. You sometimes will find one in your compost heap or in a tip box on the wall of your house, but to do a systematic survey and find all the nests in an area is more or less impossible. So a few years ago, we thought we might find a way of overcoming this. We knew that badgers are big predators of bumblebees. They dig up the nests at night and they eat the whole lot. They eat the brood, the adult bees, the wax, the comb, everything. And we figured if they must be finding them by smell, and if badgers could find them by smell, then maybe a dog could find them by smell. So one Friday afternoon after we'd been to the pub, we decided to ring the army, their animal training centre, which is in Melton Mowbray, and ask them if they'd be willing to train a dog to sniff out bumblebee nests for us. They normally train them to find explosives. And we didn't really think they'd take us seriously, but to our considerable surprise, they did. I think they were bored of training dogs to get blown up in Iraq or wherever. And they said, yeah, okay, bring us some bumblebee nest material and we'll see if we can train a dog. And so they did. So this was Chad. They started training him. Unfortunately, he was rubbish and he was sacked. So we then ended up with Quinn, the Mark II sniffer dog, who was pretty good. He spent 2 years in Scotland sniffing out nests of those great yellow bumblebees in the Outer Hebrides. And he found quite a few, but he wasn't brilliant. He was only finding about one a day, which we didn't think was good enough. So we got them to train us a third dog, Toby, and that's Steph O'Connor, who was his handler for 3 years while she did her PhD, and she spent 3 years following this dog around finding bumblebee nests, and he did find lots of bumblebee nests, but he was still never really quite the dream nest finding machine we'd hoped for, because he would find tiny little nests that we would never have found, and then he would walk straight past a whopping great nest that we knew was there, and he wouldn't twitch a muscle, and we could never work out why he would find some and not others. And the odd thing is that in the end, Steph became better at finding bumblebee nests than the dog, at which point the dog seems rather superfluous. So he's too is now retired, although he still lives with Steph up in the wilds of Scotland. So the nests they did find, we wanted to track them to see what happened to them over time. So she filmed them. She put these funny little wildlife cams that film for 24 hours a day. She put them by the entrance to each nest, and we filmed what happened so that we could see how long the nest lasted, whether it was eaten by a badger, whether it produced new queen bees, and so on. And I wish I could show you a bit of the video footage, but we tried it earlier and it didn't seem to want to work. But I can just describe it to you. I'll just give it one more go just to see if it's deciding to work now. No. Okay, so what I would like to have shown you, it's rubbish quality video, so I'll just shout while I'm over here. There's that little tiny hole, which is about 1 centimetre wide, is the entrance to a bumblebee nest, and there's a bee just up there coming into the nest. What happens in about 30 seconds of video footage is a great tit arrives and sits next to the hole, and then it picks off bees as they come and go from the nest and eats them. And we found this wasn't just a one-off. We had 8 nests that were regularly visited by different great tits, which had learnt to somehow, we don't to this day know how they found the nests. Maybe they just noticed the bees coming and going. And each bird had learnt its own way of dismembering bumblebees. Most of them snipped off the top of the thorax and scooped out the flight muscles, so there'd be this little pile of bodies next to the nest, all with the tops taken off the thorax, like a hard-boiled egg being kind of scooped out. But other birds would snip the tail off and scoop out the contents of the body that way, and so on. So our bees have declined. We don't have really good data on how fast they're declining, but we know that some species have disappeared, so that is clearly bad. Why have they declined? There are at least 4 things that are causing bumblebees to decline. The biggest long-term driver has been the way farming has changed, and the simple fact is there are hardly any flowers left in most of our countryside. But then there are also problems with disease, particularly non-native diseases, and as honeybee keepers, you'll be familiar with that concept. Pesticides I've already mentioned, and climate change is now emerging as a bit of a problem for bumblebees too, and I'll just say a little bit more about each of those. So firstly, we used to have about 7 million acres of beautiful flower-rich hay meadows like this. This is one of the surviving fragments up in the Hebrides. There are little fragments dotted around Britain where you can go and see what this habitat used to look like. But most farms used to have hay meadows because they needed hay for their winter livestock. But sadly, they switched over to using silage for their livestock in the winter, and silage fields have no flowers at all. So all of this habitat was just swept away in the 20th, virtually all of it in the 20th century. We lost about 98% of it. Elsewhere in the world, similar things have happened. This is one of the tiny fragments left of Californian flower-rich grassland. Absolutely stunning. But most of it's gone, unfortunately. Thanks. And been replaced by this kind of thing. And I don't want to launch into another tirade against farming at all, but it's kind of interesting. We now got Google Earth, and you can drop down and look at Street View of random places in the world and see what they look like. And it's amazing how many of them look the same. They look like this. Or this. That was Cambridge here. This is I think Holland or Belgium or France. I can't remember. I think that's Ohio. It could be any number of places around the world. That essentially we've created these massive fields, these huge monocultures, which we put lots of pesticides on, which enable us to grow almost pure monocultures. There are hardly any wildflowers, even around the edges. And if we're going to do that to the world, then we have to accept that wildlife will disappear, because this kind of landscape can't really support hardly any wildlife, not just bees, but anything. So that's kind of, the broader, one of the biggest drivers of bee declines and other wildlife declines. Then there are all sorts of problems with disease, and this is a whole topic in itself, which I haven't got time to go into in any detail. You'll all be familiar with the fact that bees have lots of diseases. Honeybees certainly do, but most of the diseases of honeybees are not confined to honeybees at all. They will just as happily infect bumblebees, probably solitary bees, although there have been rather few studies, quite probably other insects. And that's perfectly fine and natural. Insects have diseases. What, unfortunately, we've done to make things much worse is we've moved bees around the world, and in doing so, we've accidentally moved their diseases and their parasites with them. So you'll all know about the varroa mite, which came from Asia, but which now is almost everywhere in the world, and it's a major problem for beekeepers. But that's just one example of a parasite that we've moved around the world. You're probably also aware of Nosema cerani, which also came from Asia. Now it turns up very commonly in wild bumblebees as well as in your commercial honeybees. And the problem is that when you expose organisms to parasites that they haven't previously encountered, the effects can often be much worse than if it's a native parasite, because they haven't had a chance to evolve any resistance. And in fact, there's something really terrible happening in South America. Actually, I'll come back to that in a second. So, to start with, we moved honeybees around the world. We're doing this for hundreds of years, and we spread the diseases in those colonies all around the world, which probably had all sorts of consequences for wild bees in the countries that we took honeybees to. For example, the Americas. We have no idea what happened when we undoubtedly took a whole swathe of honeybee diseases to the Americas hundreds of years ago. But of course, nobody was studying the wild bees, so we don't know what that did, but my guess is it didn't do them any good. More recently, we've started moving bumblebees around the world. So there is now a commercial trade in bumblebees, which sprang up in the 1980s. A Dutch guy worked out how to breed bumblebees, and he realized that bumblebees were really efficient pollinators of tomatoes. So tomatoes they need buzz pollinating. The flower needs to be vibrated to pollinate it. Our honeybees are rubbish at this. They've never worked out how to do it. Bumblebees naturally do it, but they bite the anthers, and the anthers of a tomato flower, if you imagine an upturned pepper pot, the pollen is produced on the inside, and there's a little hole at the bottom, and you have to shake the anthers to get the pollen to fall out. Bumblebees grab the anthers with their mandibles, and then they buzz their flight muscles, and that shakes the pollen out the bottom, and they catch it with their legs. Some other bees can do it as well. So this Dutch guy realised that bumblebees were very efficient at pollinating tomatoes. He lived near a commercial glass house that was full of tomatoes, and the guy who owned it at the time was employing people with vibrating wands to walk around during the flowering season and buzz every tomato flower manually. You imagine it must have been a really tedious job and would have cost a lot for the farmer. Bumblebees are much more efficient at pollinating tomatoes than people, strangely. And so this guy started rearing nests in his garden shed and selling them to the local farmer who put them in his glass houses, and they pollinated his tomatoes. And in no time at all, that kind of back garden business turned into a factory. And now there are several big factories around the world producing at least 2 million bumblebee nests a year, which is why pretty much every tomato you've eaten since the late 1980s was pollinated by a bumblebee. And that's quite a nice story, except for the fact that, just as with the honeybees, those bumblebee nests very often have diseases in them. And we've now shipped a whole range of new diseases around the world with those bumblebee nests. And the worst example of the consequences of that is happening right now in South America, where they deliberately imported European buff-tailed bumblebees from the factories to Chile and let them go. Why they did that, I'm not quite sure, because they have native bumblebees. But anyway, the Chilean government did it quite deliberately. They didn't think to screen the bumblebees for diseases, and it turned out that these European bumblebees were carrying a bunch of European diseases, which the South American native bumblebees have no resistance to, and they're all being wiped out as buff-tailed bumblebees spread through Argentina and Chile. The native bumblebees are disappearing completely from everywhere that is colonized by the European bees. And it's just like what happened with people 500 years ago. The Native Americans had no resistance to the European diseases that the European explorers took with them. It's all happening all over again 500 years later. It's really depressing, and it was completely avoidable. We knew all about bee diseases by the late 90s when this was done. Anyway, the only practical bit of advice that I can say to you in this regard is don't be tempted. You might have seen there is a company that sells bumblebee nests that you can buy to put in your garden. They're really expensive. They come in a twee little wooden house like that one at the bottom, and they sell for the ridiculous price of £150. And it isn't just a wooden box. With the box you get a voucher which you send off, and a few days later you actually get a bumblebee nest delivered to put in the box, to put in your garden. But it's a nest from a big factory in Europe that's almost certainly got diseases in it. You do not want to be wasting 150 quid on a bunch of diseased bumblebees to put in your garden. So please don't buy them. Okay. Pesticides are a big deal. I think they are one of the drivers of bee declines. And this just shows you the pesticides applied to a single oilseed rape field in one season. Essentially, we're exposing bees to a whole cocktail of pesticides. So the poor bees, there aren't many flowers. They're coping with non-native diseases from Asia and all over the place, and they're being chronically poisoned with a whole mix of pesticides at the same time, none of which can be really good for them. And then finally, climate change. There was a study that came out just this year where they analysed changes in distributions of European and North American bumblebees. And they showed that they're, as you would expect, as the climate has warmed, they've shifted, the southern edges of their ranges have all shifted northwards. But what no one can really explain is that the northern edges of their ranges haven't shifted northwards. So essentially their ranges are being squashed from the bottom but not moving up at the top. So overall their ranges are contracting. Nobody knows why they're not moving north at the top, but it seems to be yet another problem that, particularly in warmer climates like southern Europe, is going to be a real issue for bumblebees. So to finish off the doom and gloom, this is what we need to avoid. You've probably seen these pictures somewhere before, but these show people in southwest China hand pollinating their apple and pear orchards. And they're hand pollinating them because there aren't any bees left. And in China, they can just about afford to do this because labor is cheap and these are high value crops. But you can't imagine a farmer hand pollinating his oilseed rape. So we desperately need to avoid this happening. And of course, even if one could hand pollinate our crops or find some other way of pollinating our crops, what about all the wildflowers that would disappear if we didn't have bees? We need to look after our bees, obviously. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that. So what can we do? Well, about 10 years ago, at the time I'd been studying bumblebees for about a decade or so, and I'd published quite a few scientific articles about why they were declining and what we might do about it. But scientific articles are only read by other scientists, and only other scientists that work on the same thing as you. Maybe 10 people might read them. And in fact, I said this at a scientific conference, and one of those scientists from the back said, well, actually, we don't read them either, which was a bit depressing. But it doesn't actually help bees to do science. Obviously, you need to take the science and do something practical, translate it into something on the ground. So back in 2006, we set up a charity devoted to actually doing that, to doing something to help bumblebees. And I'm not going to urge you to join the Bumblebee Conservation Trust at all, but I'm going to talk about some of the things the Trust is doing. But there are also things that anyone can do, or at least most of them are things that anyone can do. So what can we do? Well, the biggest thing that one might do, if you happen to have a meadow or a farm, which I'm sure most of you don't, sadly, is to try and recreate some of those flower-rich grasslands that we used to have so much of. And my second book, A Buzz in the Meadow, is about, I bought a little farm down in France, which was at the time was an arable farm, and have been turning it slowly over the last decade into a wildflower meadow for bees and butterflies and so on. It's a slower and slightly complicated process restoring those grasslands. They're very easy to destroy and quite difficult to replace, but there is expertise out there as to how to do it. And if anyone has got some land and wants to try and recreate a meadow, get in touch. I can put you on to people that can show you how to do it. Anyway, probably you don't have a field or a farm, sadly. So what other more practical suggestions are there as to what you might do? Well, actually, more broadly, I think it's just really important to raise awareness, to tell your friends, your children, whoever you know, your neighbours, about these issues. Point out to them there's more than one species of bee, for a start. Just if people don't know something exists, they're not going to care about it. They're not going to care if it disappears. If they don't know it's important, they're not going to care about it. So we need to generally raise awareness about these issues. And there are loads of ways of doing that. My standing here is doing that, hopefully. Writing books does that. Getting articles in the newspapers does that really effectively. So this is the front page of The Independent. When we launched the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, we managed to get them to give us the first 3 pages of a national newspaper. There was 180 or 190,000 people read that every day. And so hopefully that was 190,000 people who learned a little bit about bees back in 2006, if they didn't skip to page 4. So spread the word, one way or another. Particularly, I think, to children. So most kids love insects. There's quite a famous entomologist, an American guy called E.O. Wilson, who said all kids go through a bug phase, but he just didn't grow out of his. He's about 90 now, and he spent his whole life chasing around after bugs. But the sad thing is that most kids do grow out of their bug phase. By the time they're teenagers, all they want to do is squash anything that buzzes. And I don't know what goes wrong, but I think it would be something we should aim for, to try and stop that happening to them. And maybe they just need more chance to engage with nature generally than I think most kids do at present. Anyway, so when I was up in Scotland, the Scottish government paid us to develop a primary school education pack. It was all actually about the great yellow bumblebee. And these 2 pictures show you a before and after of some kids. And at the beginning, we asked them, the top there, we asked them to draw a bumblebee before we told them anything about bumblebees. And they drew these pictures of bees, pretty inaccurate, wrong numbers of legs and wings, big blobby yellow and black stripy things. Of course, they're only 7, so fair enough. But then 2 hours later, after we taught them all about bumblebees and how important and interesting they were and so on, we asked them to draw them again, and they drew much more accurate pictures with the right numbers of legs and wings and so on, which of course doesn't really matter. What is important is look how happy they've become. So look at that kid there. At the beginning he was really bored. Look at him there, absolutely loving it. Hopefully they'll remember that. So this was taken about 7 years ago. These kids are crofting kids from Lewis in the northwest of the Hebrides. And by now these kids are probably driving tractors on their parents' croft, and maybe they'll remember this and not cut down the patch of flowers or spray the herbicide or whatever. Who knows? But it would be nice if all of our kids were engaged more and knew more about the importance of bees and so on. Another way of getting people involved is through citizen science projects. And I talked about the fact that we don't have good data on the way populations of pollinators are changing over time. And it would be really nice to fill that knowledge gap, to start some long-term pollinator monitoring for all species of pollinator. And we're trying to do that at Sussex. We've started a thing called the Buzz Club, where we're asking members of the public to join this club and join in at the moment we've got 5 different experiments that will run long-term, each of which will measure different aspects of pollinator abundance. And also, hopefully, enable the people who are involved in that to find out a bit about the kind of process of science, a bit about the insects that live in their garden, and so on. So it should be a kind of fun, rewarding experience for all concerned, but generating really useful, valuable, long-term scientific data, which will identify which species of pollinator are in most need of our help. So if you're interested, have a look at the website or find us on Twitter or whatever. The most obvious thing that people can do is to garden in a bee-friendly way. Now, I'm probably preaching to the converted here because beekeepers know all about bee-friendly plants. And the plants that are good for honeybees tend to be pretty good for lots of other bees as well. So I'm not going to spend ages on this, but just a few kind of do's and don'ts. Firstly, these hideous things, please don't waste your money. So lots of people go every spring to their local garden centre and they buy trays and trays, plastic disposable trays of these plants, which will have been produced in glass houses, drenched in pesticides, often drenched in insecticides, to keep them looking perfect before you buy them. And you plant them out and they flower, and they produce lots of tasteless, overly colourful flowers all summer. You never see any insects anywhere near them because they've been intensively bred for these huge blooms, for extra petals. They're often sterile hybrids, so there's no pollen, and they've lost their scent and so on. They're travesties of flowers. Flowers evolved to attract insects, to pollinate them. These things don't do that anymore. You might as well just have some plastic flowers in your garden and be done. So do away with them. Gnomes is optional. And put in some traditional cottage garden flowers. I'm sure you all know the good ones for bees. If you don't, there's tons of information out there. My university website has a long list of really good flowers for bees and butterflies and hoverflies and so on. But it tends to be the herbs and traditional cottage garden flowers, most of which are perennials, so you only need to get them once. You don't need to buy new ones from the garden centre every year, and because they're long-lived, then you don't need to worry about them having been treated with pesticides and so on. Much more beautiful as well. And even in a window box, if you don't have a garden, right in the middle of a city, bees will find them, and you'll be doing something to help if you grow even just one lavender bush in a pot. Also squeeze in some wildflowers if you can. There are some beautiful wildflowers which thrive in gardens that don't take over, don't sort of run amok and smother everything else. Actually, teasel sometimes does run amok, so you might not bother with that. But my top tip, Viper's bugloss, top left, is really stunning, and bees of all sorts absolutely love it. It's really easy to grow. It's a biennial. It needs a sunny-ish spot, but otherwise it's very, very easy to grow. Beautiful plant in a garden. Another kind of thing I would suggest is this is another pet hate of mine. These kind of ground cover shrubs, like this blue spruce up the top right, a pampas grass and God knows what else. Look at that roundabout. That is a roundabout in Bristol that was presumably paid for by the local council. They must have paid somebody to rear those plants and plant them out and so on. Is that not the most dismal thing you ever saw? Those plants are just they're non-natives designed to smother as much ground as possible, really. And instead, why not plant native shrubs that flower, that are good for bees, that produce berries, that are good for birds? Those are just a few examples I'm sure you can recognise. Willow, hawthorn, roses, ivy, all fantastic for insects. And 3 of those 4 are really good for birds as well. And because they're native, then there'll be moth larvae that eat the leaves. There'll be all sorts of other insects that live on them. So if possible, why not plant native shrubs and trees rather than non-natives? And why waste money on awful things like that roundabout in Bristol? Okay, nearly done. If you don't have a garden at all, then badger your local council to let you plant flowers on their land. There's loads of amenity grasslands, parks, roads, verges and so on, which are just mown over and over again, useless for wildlife, just flat green grass. Up in Stirling, where I used to work, there's a campaign group called On the Verge. That's their little sign. And they've just been badgering anyone who manages the local land, primary schools, rugby clubs, the local council, to let them at the weekend go in and dig over patches of land and plant wildflower seeds. And there are now 52 patches of flowers dotted all around Stirling. If you drive around Stirling, that's a road verge, this is a roundabout, there's some along the edge of a rugby pitch and so on. Compare that to that roundabout in Bristol. Is that not so much more attractive? Okay, nearly done. I'll skip on. Bumblebee nest boxes. Other things you might do would include providing nest sites. Bumblebee nest boxes don't actually work very well. You can buy boxes from garden centres to put in your garden in the hope that bumblebees will nest in them. They hardly ever do. But solitary bee hotels work really well and are really, really easy to make. All you need is a hole about 8mm diameter in a piece of wood, or a bamboo cane will do. So that ugly looking post on the left is just an old post, an old piece of wood that I sunk in the ground, and I drilled a load of holes in 2 years ago with a drill bit, with a drill. And literally within 20 minutes of drilling those holes in the spring, I had little mason bees, top right there, coming and investigating to nest in them. It worked really, really well. Any piece of wood, just drill some holes in it, stick it up on a sunny wall or fence or whatever, and you'll get mason bees in early spring, and if you're lucky later in the year, you'll get leafcutter bees. That's a leafcutter bee, bottom right. There are all sorts of ways you can build them. There's information if you go to the Buzz Club website. This is just a photograph that we just got sent in by one of the members of the Buzz Club who'd been busy making up solitary bee hotels over the winter for next spring. Really easy to do, and they really do work. And it's great for kids to be able to see these little bees filling up the tubes with pollen. They seal them up with mud when each tube is full, and then they start a new one and so on. Completely harmless little things. They never sting anybody, and really nice to see in your garden. Okay, so it seems to me that bees provide a really nice kind of foot in the door to engage people with caring about biodiversity. It's really easy to explain to people that bees are important because they pollinate our crops. Without bees, we wouldn't have 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food. You all know the statistics. But of course, it isn't just bees that we need. We need to look after the whole of biodiversity. There are hosts of other creatures that do important things, which may not be quite as easy to explain or as obvious what they do for us as bees. But for example, all the predators of crop pests, the things like ladybirds and hoverflies and lacewings and so on, the dung beetles and flies that break down dung, worms that keep the soil healthy and so on. We need to look after biodiversity more broadly. And bees are maybe a foot in the door to engage people who otherwise, up till now, haven't been interested in caring. So all I just say to finish off is bees have been around for, as I said earlier, 120 million years. They've been pollinating our crops for the last 10,000 years, which is as long as we've been growing crops. And now they are in trouble. We need to do something to help. We owe them one, if you like. So I'd urge you all to do something to help our wild bees. And maybe if everyone does something, then that will really make a difference. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I will be selling these out in the foyer afterwards if anyone wants one. Perfect Christmas present. Thank you very much.
I'm going to counter your pampas grass argument. If you cut them every year, as you're supposed to do, yes, they're no use. If you allow them to expand, and some people just down the road from me have got a pampas grass that they hadn't cut for 3 or 4 years, they were being plagued by bumblebees. And when I went in this spring, there were 5 bumblebee nests in the bottom of the pampas grass.
Okay, I think everyone heard that. Perhaps I should backtrack. I've never heard of bumblebees nesting in pampas grass, but I'm delighted to hear that they do. Okay, so squeeze in a bit of pampas grass if you must.
I just wanted to ask, with the bumblebee nests, lots of people buy them and they say they don't work, as you said. We know with honeybees, the sort of height and location, if we're trying to attract bees in, i.e. higher than most people would think, etc. What would you say would be the best height for your bumblebee, solitary bee nests to be hung at or placed at?
The best height, so for bumblebee nests, I just wouldn't bother. Most bumblebee species nest underground, so normally you're advised to put them on the ground, but they just don't get used. What you often do get are tree bumblebees, which is one species that will happily nest in tip boxes up on the wall, and they like to nest, they're the only British species that likes to nest up in the air. But generally, I wouldn't bother. I think bumblebees find their own nests in your gardens. But the solitary bee nest boxes, actually, they're not too fussy. They will nest in them at more or less any height, but I normally put them up at kind of breast height, and that seems to work really well. I don't know if there's a maximum height beyond which they wouldn't find them, but it isn't critical at all.
Thank you.
You showed the quite barren picture of the wind farms. Is there any governmental policy that you're aware of that's driving a return to meadowland?
So, not really, not a very effective one. The farmers there are agri-environment schemes available to farmers where they can get payments for planting species-rich grasslands, for actually recreating those meadows if they want to. And there are sort of smaller scale schemes where they can get money for just putting in a 6-metre strip of flowers down the sides of their fields. The problem is the funding has recently changed and been cut, and it's harder than ever for farmers to get in. So it's competitive to get that funding, and a lot of farmers fill in some complicated forms, say that they want to plant a field of flowers, and then they get turned down for funding. It's a really complicated business. So even those farmers that want to do this often don't get the funding, and then those that do often find that it's quite difficult. It's a long and fiddly process establishing a hay meadow, particularly if the soil has got high fertility from having lots of fertilizer applications when crops were being grown on it. So often it doesn't actually work very well, and the farmer gives up after a couple of years. There's a little bit of help out there, but it's nowhere near enough, and it's not actually achieving very much at the moment. There's only a tiny area of these kind of habitats being created in Britain, sadly.
Well, I work with a group in London that wants cemeteries to go wild. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, imagine, so I think we should target all of these areas. You know, gardens can be, we know that urban areas are already actually quite good for bees. I'm sure you've all heard about, urban beekeeping in London has become very popular, and at least to start with, hives were getting really high honey yields, and that's because there are lots of flowers in urban areas compared to the countryside, but there could be a lot more, couldn't there? Because some gardens are rubbish, some parks are rubbish, some cemeteries are rubbish. But if we could get more gardens with bee-friendly flowers, if we could get parks with bee-friendly flowers, if we could get the cemeteries with bee-friendly flowers, the roundabouts, the road verges and so on, then collectively we could turn urban areas into huge kind of bee nature reserves, which would be really, really cool. So cemeteries, absolutely, they can be wonderful, can't they? Because obviously they don't get ploughed. Some cemeteries are full of flowers and bees and butterflies, but many aren't. So, yeah, great idea. Everything we can do is good.
You mentioned the tree bumblebees, which seem to be bucking the trend and expanding extremely. Do you have an explanation of why they should be doing so much better than other bumblebees, and do you see them as a threat to other bumblebee species?
So tree bumblebees arrived in 2001. My claim to fame in life is that I caught the very first one, but they're a European species that colonised Britain. We think naturally. I can't imagine why anyone would have brought them in. And they are the success story in the bumblebee world. One I caught was in the New Forest, but they've now spread to Scotland. They're really common. I think that the key to their success is they're garden bees. They're garden specialists. There are hardly any in the countryside, but they love gardens and garden flowers, and they love to nest in tip boxes in people's lofts, under the loft insulation. So they're called the tree bumblebee because they naturally nest in holes in trees, which is something no other bumblebee does. So the combination of garden flowers and all these nest sites that we provide for them by putting up tip boxes and by having houses with loft insulation, that's what they're taking advantage of. So I think that's why they've booked the trend. Are they a threat? I don't think so. I guess in Europe, they've always occurred alongside all the other species that we have in Britain without any problems. So there's no real reason why they should create huge problems here. But even if they were a threat, to be honest, there's not a great deal we could do about it. And I think we should be pleased to see at least one species thriving rather than worrying about whether they're doing any harm. There's no evidence that they have done any harm thus far. Although, sorry to ramble on, they do evict the birds, which is quite amazing for a little bumblebee. They will throw blue tits out of their nests, basically, or at least disturb them so much the blue tits abandon, and then the bees move in.
Thank you very much. I'm Dixon from Uganda. Mine is not a question as per se, but looking at people who do monoculture, I mean, the factories or people with pesticides are smart. So I'm wondering how we, the beekeepers, can do to become smart like them, so that for them their message reaches the farmers quite easily to buy pesticides or something to improve their crops. And we know that bees could help their crops. How do we reach them? Do you have any idea on how?
That might be beyond the expertise of someone who studies bumblebees. There are big issues with the way farming has gone, and it seems to me that the current farming system has been shaped by big industries to maximise their profit, and it's not in the interests of farmers or the environment or us as consumers, people who live on the planet. This current system of very intensive farming with huge pesticide inputs. But how we change that is a really difficult one, because there are very, very rich, powerful vested interests in the current system, and we need to find ways to fight back, but it's very difficult to do that. But bees are maybe one way of tackling this. As I mentioned a minute ago, they're a really easy example of an illustration of what goes wrong if we use too many pesticides, if we go down this really super intensive farming route, because it harms the bees, and everyone understands that that's bad. So maybe bees are one tool for kind of fighting back against this trend. But it needs a cleverer man than me to sort this one out, I think.